questions, especially for somebody from India. Okay, so let's deal with this question first about Vatican II. So he said he had asked so many people and everybody gave him a different answer. And I would imagine that if you get 20 people in the room and you ask 20 Catholics in the room and you ask them if Vatican II was infallible, you get two different answers. Some people saying it's not infallible and some people saying it's infallible. Okay. And I told him, I said, look, the reason you're getting these range of answers from everybody is because the church has not really made it clear whether Vatican II is infallible or not. If you really want to get down to the brass tacks here. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It's the church's job that if there is an infallible statement, then they are required to make it crystal clear, not just clear, crystal clear, that the statement, the council, the this, the that, whatever it is infallible. They are required to do that. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church has not done that. It's done a very poor job of letting us know when an infallible statement has been made, when a infallible council makes a infallible statement. Even in the Council of Trent, I've heard people say that the chapters of the Council of Trent are not infallible. Only the canons are. Okay. If that's true, I would like to know it from the church, not somebody's opinion. I mean, I can see why somebody would say that the canons are infallible, but not necessarily the chapters. Okay. And then again, that doesn't necessarily mean the chapters have anything wrong with them. Okay. So this whole infallibility thing really needs to be ironed out, and it should be one of the first things that a Catholic understands when he becomes Catholic. Is what does infallibility mean? When does it apply? Who has the authority to say it? Blah, 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 blah. I run into this a lot with the Galileo issue. Somebody will say, oh, well, what Paul V did and Pope Urban VIII, they're not infallible, so we don't have to pay any attention to them. Okay, so there's two issues there. One is, well, how do you know they're not infallible? What pope or council ever declared infallibly that they weren't infallible? Okay, and they'll, because there is none. Okay, it's just their opinion. Okay, and they'll have, everybody has all kinds of opinions as to what's infallible, what's not infallible. Okay, and now there's a second thing I want to say. I forget what it was. Even if it's not infallible, okay, it's still authoritative. And until if and when someone finds an error in some particular part of that authoritative statement, you are obliged to obey it if you call yourself Catholic. Okay. So there's really no excuse. You might say technically it's not infallible, and you can have your opinion about that, of course, because no authority has ever said it was infallible or not infallible. Okay. But then it's a church document, so you're still under the authority of that church document until if and when the church says you're not under the authority. Okay. And it's got to be done legally, canonically, all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. Okay. And that has never happened. Okay. So I find the same thing with Vatican II. A lot of traditionalists say, oh, you get a lot of hand waving with Vatican II. we're not under Vatican II. That's just a fake council, this, that, and the other thing. No, I beg to differ. You may argue whether it's infallible or not, and of course you're entitled to your opinion. Okay, and a lot of them will go by, Paul VI statement. This does not have the note of infallibility, whatever that means. Okay, and what I mean by that is we don't take subjects like this and make casual statements like this doesn't have the note of infallibility and expect everybody to understand what does that mean. Does that mean that Vatican II has nothing infallible about it, or what is the note of infallibility? If you think of a musical note or a message note, I mean, what does that statement actually mean? What I think has to happen is this question about Vatican II has been tossed around for the last 60 years, and the Vatican has never come out with a statement that says Vatican II was not infallible or Vatican II was infallible. Never. And so the confusion is going to continue. And you're going to get opinions from this person, that person, that are going to be conflicting. Okay. I remember when, I'm thinking of Humanae Vitae in 1968, and in 1994, there was Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which John Paul II issued, dealing with the women in the priesthood. Can a woman become a priest? And he wrote Ordinatio Sacerdotalis that said no. Okay. And there was a big debate about that. Was that infallible? Okay. And why would a question like that come up? Because the Pope didn't put at the end of the paragraphs, this is an infallible and irreformable statement by Pope John Paul II, and then sign his name to it. You get all kinds of authoritative language. You get, I'm the shepherd of the church kind of thing, which leads to someone thinking that, okay, we may have here the qualifications of Pastor Aeternus, written in 1870 by Pope Pius IX, dealing with papal infallibility, or we may not. Because there's a lot of documents that are written, I'm the shepherd of the church, blah, 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 blah. Even Galileo's statements were written like that. The Pope's statements against Galileo were written like that. So this kind of guessing game the Catholics have to engage in, whether a council, a statement, whatever, is infallible or not, is just going on far too long. The infallibility doctrine issued by Pius IX in 1870 is supposed to help us, not confuse us. Okay? The idea that an ecumenical council, and Vatican II was the 23rd ecumenical council, wherein we would think that ecumenical councils are infallible, whether their language is written in canons or not. Okay. You can make a statement and put an anathema after it. Does that make it infallible because you put an anathema after it? It makes it serious, yeah. But unless the church says this is an infallible statement, how are you really going to know for sure? Okay. And that's their job. And they've been delinquent on that job, especially with some council as controversial as Vatican II has been. So it would behoove the church to move on this issue, to tell us once and for all what's the status of Vatican II. And even if it's not infallible, they come out with a clear statement. Well, this is not infallible. Okay, so now we know an ecumenical council cannot be infallible. And now we know that it's not infallible, but at least it's authoritative. And unless we find something in those authoritative statements that are fallacious, then we're under requirement to obey them. That's simple enough. Okay. And then I was going to deal with Humanae Vitae. You have the same problem here. Oh, well, let me go back to Ordinatio Sacerdotalis in 1994. So there's this big debate going on whether this papal statement, barring women for the priesthood, is infallible or not. And again, I say, why? Well, because he didn't say it was infallible. That's why. So if you're not going to even use the word infallible in your statement, or irreformable would be another choice, then you're going to cause confusion, especially if something as important as whether women can be priests or not. Okay? So this kind of language that the church has been using, where we have to play a guessing game whether something's infallible or not, that does no one any service at all. Okay? So what happened in that case of Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is that Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at that time, said, oh, it's infallible. He was asked by the press or some contingent of high cardinals, and he said, yes, it's infallible. But, you can see the problem with that already, can't you? Okay. Cardinal Ratzinger's statement is not infallible because he's not the Pope. He can make a mistake in judging that document as infallible. He could have just wanted these people off his neck and said, yeah, it's infallible. Okay, but why would they even have to ask the question? Okay, I mean, even canon law says that something is not infallible unless it's made clear that it's infallible. I think that's what, Canon 734, if I'm not mistaken. So even canon law says what I'm saying. Unless you make it clear, don't expect people to believe that it's infallible. Okay, so that issue came up with, the women priest issue came up as causing confusion. Because of this, ambiguous language that the church uses. And you have the same problem with Humanae Vitae. Now, here is something that was, especially at the time that Humanae Vitae was written, right when the birth control pill came out. And you need to know from your church, is this an infallible statement from the Pope that artificial birth control is disallowed for Catholic women? And the church never followed up on that question. Everybody was left guessing. Now, that didn't mean Humanae Vitae didn't have an impact. It certainly did, because even if it's not infallible, it's authoritative. Okay. But I hate to say this, but I think sometimes they don't want to say it's infallible because then they know it can't be changed. Can't be reformed. That's what the word irreformable means. That's why you usually find the word irreformable whenever something's infallible, because that means it can't be reformed. Because if it's infallible, obviously, you've got the right answer. You can't change it. So, but none of those words were used in Humanae Vitae. Infallible or irreformable. Okay. But if it's a constant teaching of the church, and the last remarks that we have about birth control were from Casti Connubii, written by Pius the 11th. Okay, so one can say here, you got the constant teaching of the church. Now, of course, they didn't have birth control prior to the 1900s, okay, except they might have had different ways. They didn't have the pill or any other artificial means except, maybe hangers, like they used to use or whatever methodology they use. They would think some herbs might cause you not to become pregnant. Who knows? But the mentality is what is of concern to the church, not so much how artificial or what artificial device you use. It's the mentality that I'm going to control the amount of births that I have as a woman. And the church's answer to that has always been no. And so somebody can make an argument that this is the ordinary teaching of the church and, make a case that ordinary teaching is infallible. Now, here's another issue. This is another wrinkle about this whole infallibility thing. And it's not that I'm against them being infallible. I wish they were infallible. But I just want the church to be clear on it. And the other is, if the ordinary teaching's infallible, well, you're going to get 10 people in a room. They're going to have different opinions on that. Because they're going to say, well, maybe that's not an ordinary teaching. When did it come about? And who taught it? And what was the context? And blah, 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 blah. And they'll argue about this till kingdom come. And so even that label, somebody wants to put it, this is the ordinary teaching of the church, therefore it's infallible. That still has holes in it that need to be plugged up. And the church needs to say, okay, well, limiting birth is against church teaching, and this is infallible. It's never going to change. It's never going to be reformed. Just use those words. What's so hard about using those words? Okay. So again, the church has had the opportunity, and she needs, because look, infallibility, you're talking about some highfalutin doctrine here. This is not just, whether you have an indulgence or not, if you dip your hand in the holy water and make the sign of the cross. You're saying that this man, who is normally fallible in everything he says or does, has an exception to the rule of humanity, wherein he now, whatever he puts down in writing and signs his name to it, he actually doesn't even have to write it. He could just say it and declare that this is an infallible statement. We accept it, okay, but usually it's written, and sign his name to it, date it, and as the shepherd of the church, and say, this is infallible. Well, now he's just made himself just like God, and God allows him to do that. That's why Jesus gave to Peter the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind, heaven will bind. So if we know heaven can't lie and heaven can't reform a doctrine because heaven's going to get it right the first time, that means Peter can't lie either. And therefore he's going to tell the truth. And that's infallible. Okay. And we know this by the fact that he says whatever. It's the aeon conjunction in the Greek, which means whatever you decide to bind, heaven will bind. Okay. Now, what the church has done with that is said, okay, not everything that the Pope says is in the infallible category. Jesus said whatever, so we're going to say, okay, here's the whatever. The whatever applies to only the times that the Pope sits on his chair and gives a decree under these conditions. That's when we say that he is binding in the infallible sense. So the church can make their own rule. Okay, and as long as she follows that rule. And anything else the Pope says could be authoritative, or it could be his own opinion or whatever. Okay, that's the whatever too, because on those cases we've decided that the Pope's not infallible on those. Okay, but the church decided what was going to be the condition for the Pope to be infallible. Okay, and that's given in Pastor Itinerants. You have to have 4 criteria, but you see, the problem with those is those criteria are a little ambiguous. They're a little vague and ambiguous, because when how do you define the church being a universal teaching? Okay, I made the case that the Galileo thing was a universal teaching of the church. Why? Because the Pope sent all the decree out to all the papal nuncios and university professors of Europe, binding them all to what the church decreed in 1633. Okay, so is that not a universal teaching? Okay, so see, but I'll get people, I'll tell that to them, they go, oh no, that's not infallible at all. Doesn't even meet any of the criteria. Okay, and so everybody makes up their own judgment, but that could all go away if the church would just say, Humanae Vitae, this is an infallible and irreformable teaching of the church. You better obey it. Or you could say, this is not an infallible and irreformable teaching of the church. Okay? If you have the guts, the courage to be truthful with the people. Okay? Now you might get a lot of people saying, well, why isn't it infallible and irreformable? Are you saying that it could be changed? Well, church, come on. Can it be changed or not? You're the authority. You're the one who has the keys of the kingdom. Then tell us. That's not too much to ask, whether we're doing right or wrong based on what you teach us. So let us know. What's the big secret? Okay. Now, some people say, well, maybe God doesn't declare it infallible because he's just testing people. Because if the church is authoritative in that decree, well, you should obey it anyway. So he wants to separate all these people who will only obey what's infallible in the church from what's authoritative. Yeah, there are a lot of people like that. I'll only obey the church when she makes an infallible statement. Okay, so no, you're not being Catholic. Okay, you're required to obey everything the church teaches authoritatively, whether it's infallible or not infallible. Okay, and if you think that you can escape an authoritative teaching because there's some error there, well, let's see, what do you think the error is? Bring it to the church and ask them, is this an error? And then you got to go by what the church says. And if the church says, no, it's not an error, okay, then your opinion has been shot down. And then you're required to obey that authoritative teaching, because you have an official declaration from the church that there is no error in that authoritative teaching. Okay. So that goes for Vatican II, as I said. So even with Pope Boniface and Pope Eugene IV in their statements, extra ecclesiam nulla salus and all this stuff, have they ever been deemed infallible by the Catholic Church? Do we have any list from the Catholic Church that gives us council by council, papal statement by papal statement that says this is infallible and irreformable? No, we have nothing like that. So no wonder people argue about these things. Okay? And it would be very easy for the church to make an index of infallible teachings of the church. Probably be one of the most popular books ever sold by the Catholic Church. But they haven't. Okay. So I think that's negligence. I really do. For a doctrine as good and beneficial as infallibility, how it's been disseminated and taught and judged, bad. Okay. So you're going to continue to get these different opinions about Vatican II until the church, if and when she decides to clarify the issue. And don't count on it happening tomorrow. All right. So let's deal with this Pope Boniface's statement, Pope Eugene IV statement about, you know, you have to be a member of the Catholic Church in order to be saved. And Vatican II comes along and says, the Muslims are in the plan of salvation, and not only the Muslims, but everybody else. So how do you reconcile these? The way you reconcile these is you have to look at the context in which they were written. Pope Eugene and Pope Boniface were dealing in a period of time in the second millennium now. We didn't have this problem in the first millennium. We had it in the second millennium because the world was a lot bigger. And the Muslims had gained a lot of ground from 600 AD when they started to the 1300s and 1400s when Pope Boniface and Pope Eugene were making their statements. You had the Jews, who were not an issue in the first millennium because they were in Babylon for 1,000 years. And then they started to migrate through Russia and then came to Europe. And by the 1300s and 1400s, they became an issue, okay, and have been ever since. You had around this time, you had no Protestants in the first millennium, but by the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, you had a whole slew of them. And then finally, Luther comes in the 1500s, but he's just one of many that started way earlier. John Wycliffe, the Hussites, all kinds of groups and individuals were making statements saying that they didn't need the Catholic Church to be saved, that they're going to interpret the Bible for themselves. And the Catholic Church has made so many mistakes about their Bible interpretation, it can't be trusted. So you had the pre-Protestants, you had the Jews, you had the Muslims all coming against the church and saying, you're not the premier authority. And again, that didn't happen in the first millennium. Okay. So what do Boniface and Eugene have to do? Well, they got to reiterate the Catholic position. No, sorry. The gospel was given to the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church alone. And if you think that you can be saved outside the Catholic Church because you're going to interpret the Bible for yourself, you are wrong. Let us tell you here and now, we are going to draw our line in the sand. And if you're on the other side of that line, you're damned to hell. And the church has every right to make that declaration, because you are not going to make up the rules for how Christianity is to be conducted. That's the church's job, because she has the authority to do so, and no one else has that authority. And basically, that's what you're saying to the church. If you think, as a Jew, you don't need to be saved in the Catholic Church, you're calling yourself as the authority. It's plain and simple. Okay? So the church shot that down as best she possibly could, and she was right in doing so. No, you can't be saved as a Jew. Make your own church. You can't be saved as a Protestant. Making your own church, making your own rules, defining salvation the way you want to, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So now Vatican II comes along, and she doesn't say that the Muslim can be saved as someone outside the Catholic Church. Never says that. Okay. Never says that about the Jew or the Protestant. What does Vatican II say? What does Lumen Gentium mean when it says the Muslims are in the plan of salvation? Nothing contradictory. Look, the Bible itself says in 1 Timothy 2:4, God desires all men to be saved. Can you think of an exception to that? No, because there is no exception. God desires all men to be saved. Muslims, Jews, heretics, Catholics, Protestants, every single one of them. So the plan of salvation, ipso facto, includes Muslims, Jews, heretics, and anybody else you can think of. It wasn't that God made the plan of salvation and said, oh, I'm going to exclude the Muslims from this. No possibility that a Muslim can be saved. I don't like the Muslims. You know, I don't like the Chinese. They can't be saved. Yeah. I don't like the Mongolians. They can't be saved. Thank God we don't have a God like that. Because that means he's a respecter of persons. And he's judging the worthiness of someone's attaining salvation based on their ethnicity, the country they're from, what language they speak, all kinds of external things. Excuse me, I have a fly running around here. And that's not the kind of God we have. In Romans chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, Paul says, God is no respecter of persons. He gives the gospel to the Jew and the Gentile. And as a matter of fact, he says in that same chapter, that the Gentiles obey it more readily than the Jews do. The Gentiles have the law of God written on their heart. And if they obey that law through their conscience, they can be justified. That's what he says in verse 13. By the works of the law, they will be justified. Talking about the Gentiles. Okay. Well, who's a Gentile? All those groups I just mentioned. The Muslims, the heretics, the Hussites, the, Lutherans, the Methodists, the Baptists. Yeah, they're all Gentiles. Okay. Now, yeah, they've got a lot of things wrong, but God doesn't exclude them from the plan of salvation. And that's all that Lumen Gentium is talking about. They're included in the plan of salvation. That's it. It doesn't say whether they're going to be saved, what the likelihood is that they're saved, nothing like that at all. Okay? Because it's not talking about the means of salvation, it's talking about the scope of salvation, as my friend himself figured out. Okay? So, by the same token, Boniface can call the Muslims, what did he call them? The abomination of Muhammad and all this stuff. And he's correct. Why? Because it's a false gospel. Okay? It's a false gospel. He has every right to damn the Mohammedan religion. Because there can only be one true faith. And we're it. Okay? So he's right on, spot on. Okay? So in other words, what you have to do, you have to understand the context of what was written before you go judge what was written. And if there's one idea I can implant into the minds of who's ever investigating this is context. I know we've heard that before, always got to look at the he taking it out of context, all this stuff, but it's important. Or else you're going to see contradictions all over the place. Okay. Now, so no hand waving Vatican II. You can't do that. This is an ecumenical council of the church. Paul VI signed every single document that came from that council, 16 in all. Never has the church ever said that there is an error in any of these teachings. Okay. Oh, I know there's a lot of people who think there's errors there. And I know some people who thought there were errors there and came to reconcile and said, well, no, that's not really an error. I've seen that happen a lot of times. Okay. And again, I said the church could clear this up by dealing with Vatican II, the objections that people have, whether it really is infallible and irreformable or not. The people depend on the church. And they need to take their job a lot more seriously than they have. And we all know the problems that we've had in the church in the last half of the 20th century and now beginning in the 21st century. And they are lax like nobody's business. So I don't expect great things from them. But that doesn't damage our faith, because our faith is not just in the church, it's in the head of the church, and that's Jesus Christ. He is true and trustworthy, and we know that he's biding his time, and when the proper time comes, he will speak and he will judge. We just have to wait. All right, so that deals with that question. Two hot questions there. And so now I'll go to the board here. Spent, 50 minutes on that thing. Okay, let's see where we are here. Well, we don't have too many tonight. All right. Roberto G has a question. It's scary when God will say, don't pray for them, and will let people dive into their sin. For example, I remember you've talked about homosexuals in one of your shows where you've said that at one point God had it and says enough, and not only will not help them, but will actively make them dive into their sin even more, where sin consumes them completely. Can you elaborate? I hesitate to get into this really deep there, Roberto, because we did this last week. This is the very same question I dealt with last week. So go to YouTube and bring up the passage, or bring up the show that I did on, let's say, 29th, so the 22nd of June, 2022, and see what I said there, because I want to say the same thing here, and I don't want to be redundant, and I do want to give room for other people to ask questions. So, but you're right in your characterization, okay? And I think I went on for 50 minutes on that very question. And I covered it as thoroughly as I could. Okay, so if you don't mind, Roberto, go to YouTube and look up that. It's the first question that I deal with on the show, so you don't have to go searching for it. Okay? All right. Ethel McGillicuddy. Really? Robert, was there a time in your life you had doubt about your Catholic faith? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was born and raised a Catholic. Came from a nice Italian Catholic family. My grandparents came right from Italy on both sides. Came from Italy, and they were very strict Catholics. My parents followed right along, but I started asking a lot of questions about religion and the Catholic faith and God when I was let me see, what was I, a junior in high school? Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about God a lot and, whether there really was a God and all that stuff. Um, my father didn't really believe in God. He's one of those Catholics who, you know, went to mass and, you know, did, um, certain things, but he didn't believe in God. And um, so I didn't get it from him, but I just had this natural inquisitiveness about God because, God says, look, I put the seeds right in your heart. So it's not like you can deny I exist. And they bother me. I didn't have all the answers, of course. And some of the priests I talked to at the Catholic high school I went to, they helped a little, but my questions were really deep. And I kind of felt sorry for them in a way because I knew they couldn't answer them. And the ones that did answer, their answers weren't satisfactory. So I sort of left high school with a gaping hole. Um, and then when I got to college, there were no Catholics, and most of them were Jews, as a matter of fact, at George Washington University. Um, um, so I was on my own. I was on my own. I did have one Jewish friend, and we always used to talk about God. And we both agreed that if God exists, then he must be love, because love seemed to be the answer to the world's problems. Just like the Beatles said, love, love, love. But that just goes so far, it's, and so, but then it's funny that he was a Jewish guy and we talked about God, and um, he eventually went his way and I went my way and I never saw him again. But oh no, I did see him one more time, and he came over to. I had an apartment in Washington D.C., and by this time I had totally had conversion experience and was totally with God and with Jesus, um, and was even going back to the Catholic Church at that time. And he came up to visit me, and as soon as he saw the Jesus picture on the wall, um, kind of turned him off, and so he left, and I never saw him after that. So um, I'll have to find out. Maybe I could find out. I'll make a note to myself. At any rate, what question am I trying to answer here? Oh, doubt about my Catholic faith. Yeah. So I left my Catholic faith there for about 2 years when I was 16, 17, and 18. I didn't leave it when I was 16. I left it probably when I was 17 and 18. Yeah. And then at 19 is when I had my conversion experience where it was just as if Jesus was standing right next to me. And that was what, 45 years ago. So those were the only 2 years of my life that I doubted my faith. And they were deep doubts, very deep doubts. I wanted answers. And I didn't get them even when I had my experience, but I knew I could find them eventually, at least. And I'm still finding them. So the search never ends. And what I do know becomes more crystal clear to me as I move on. But the mystery of God continually excites me every day that I wake up, and I'm ready for the next challenge in knowing how God wants me to understand him. And that satisfies me. So, all right. So thank you for that question, Ethel. Question: what is your favorite Bible commentary other than your own? I have a number of them. Some of them are even Protestant, believe it or not. Yeah, in the verses that we don't have a conflict, with some, Reformed or Lutheran or whatever. Some of their commentaries can be very good, and I use them. Okay, and that's because they go into the Greek grammar or the Hebrew grammar, and they know their stuff. Okay, so I use them. I use some Catholic commentaries. I use, um, you know, what's it called? Haydock. I use him. I use Orchard. Um, I even use Raymond Brown's commentary, the Jerome Biblical Commentary, believe it or not. Mostly it's filled with junk, but there are some things that are good. So I keep that around. So it's a whole bunch, and I use a lot of grammars, Greek grammars. One of my favorites is A.T. Robertson. Came out with his fourth um, grammar of the Greek New Testament, which is the best that's ever been written. Nobody's improved on it, and he's gone through 4 editions. He's improved on his own, and there's nothing like it to tell you what's behind the Greek language in the New Testament. So I use that quite often. I use Nicole's Greek grammar. What else do I use? Yeah, there's just a lot of them. One of my favorites that was simple, it's a Protestant one, was Jameson Fawcett, and Brown. Very good, simple, but highly scholarly commentary to let you know these guys really had a grasp. They're Anglicans, but they really had a grasp of biblical context. Now, of course, where they disagree with the Catholics, I'll read their stuff, but I know it's wrong. Okay. And sometimes I go into those passages to find out where they went off the track. Okay. Like if I'm in a debate, I'll need to read what the other side says, where they're getting these ideas from, and I can see, by the commentaries where they went off the track. So they're helpful there. So I even use Martin Luther and John Calvin's commentaries. I have them on my shelf. Okay. Because sometimes they get it right on and are very useful. So, what's a saying? Even a stop clock is right twice a day. So, all right. Next question. Una says, my pious Irish grandmother taught me that if I sewed on Sunday, on the last day, St. Patrick would force me to rip out the stitches with my nose. Did Vatican II change that? No, Vatican II didn't change that. No, sorry. You know why? Because it was never true in the first place for them to change it. Okay. So rest assured, St. Patrick is not going to do that to you. Yeah, see, that's called an old wives' tale. Okay. Paul even uses that phrase in his New Testament. Which one was it? First Timothy, was it? He says, don't listen to old wives' tales. And you just got one there, Luna. So I have just freed you from that. All right. Send your money to, blah, 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 blah. That's what they do on TV. I was just watching TV the other day, and I don't know if you guys have ever watched Peter Popoff. Peter Popoff. He's been around for, at least 40 years. And he doesn't age, this guy. His wife is sitting next to him. She's aged, but he doesn't age. And he's still doing the same thing. Put your hand on the TV set, and I'll send the healing graces of God to you. And then when all that's done, and here's our address, send your money to blah, blah. He's been doing the same thing for 40 years. So be careful. You don't get as many of them on the TV as you used to. But they're still out there. Peter's a survivor. Okay. Question. Did you hear about Pelosi receiving communion at the Vatican today? Gosh. Leave it to Nancy. She wasn't satisfied by going to the Jesuits here in the U.S. and sticking her nose up at, was it Bishop McManus out there in San Francisco? Yeah. This woman is possessed. I believe she's possessed. And she's going to do whatever she can to hold her ground until the day she dies. It's amazing to watch. She's like in her 80s. It's like, woman, where do you get your energy from? My goodness. But yeah, so you see where the Vatican is today. Here I am crying about, tell us whether Vatican II is infallible or not. And they're giving communion to Nancy Pelosi. So, like I said, I don't expect great things from today's Vatican. Okay. I just hope it holds together, until we get somebody who knows what they're doing in there. But yeah, this is par for the course. The left is going to get more left, and they're going to be more in your face, especially after Roe v. Wade was neutralized. Yeah, you can just feel it coming. Okay, so get ready for the war. Okay, and Nancy's just, trying to get the rubber stamp on her position of abortion, and the Vatican just gave it to her today. Okay, because a lot of them are for abortion. Yeah, a lot of them think that this little baby in the sack is just a pile of flesh and is not human. Even though that heartbeat starts what? After 8 days, for Pete's sake? They still think it's not human. Okay, so these people are deranged. They are possessed. I really do believe that. And anyway, let me go on here. Question. Pat says, do you agree that slot? You mean a lot? Do you agree that a lot have fallen away, or lukewarm Catholics have succumbed to the liberal ideologies because of the lack of catechesis in our diocese? It seems so unfair they will be lost because of lack of education in our churches. Yeah, what is it? Hosea 6 verse 6 says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because the prophets weren't doing their job. Read Jeremiah 23, where God talks about the prophets not teaching the people, and instead getting drunk and having orgies among themselves. Yeah. So I have never been to an RCIA class, but I hear they're horrendous. And that I have heard just recently of some newbies. When I say newbies, I'm talking about they're just coming into the Catholic faith, and they're required to go to RCIA classes, and because they love the Catholic Church, but they get to the RCIA and they hear the teacher, and these people, all of them except for a couple, walked out of the class because of the horrendous things that were being taught by, it's probably not the priest. Oh, they don't lower themselves to do that anymore. That's given to the lay people to do. Okay. And so you get some lay Catholics in there who don't have a clue what they're saying or what the Catholic Church is about, and teaching RCIA classes, and it's horrendous. Okay. So, earlier in the church, the 20th century's been a disaster. Okay. But early in the 1900s and late in the 1800s, we had great catechesis. Catholics were taught their faith backwards and forwards, but you could hardly find. There are some still good churches out there, but they are few and far between. And but look, Pat, God will have mercy on those who do not have the proper knowledge. Okay. How much mercy? I don't know. But as much as you've been deliberately kept from the truth is the degree of mercy God will have on you. Okay. And that just makes sense. Our catechism teaches that as well. God's going to take everything into account when he judges us. And that can only, of course, come from a God who's omniscient, because he would know every single detail of our life. Okay? So rest assured, even though they went through this horrendous experience with RCIA and the liberal theologies, that God will judge them accordingly. Okay? We can depend on that. So that's one thing we know about God, is that he is fair and he is just and he loves us. Okay? I mean, there's nothing fearful about standing before God and being judged, because he will give the exact truth and treat you the most proper way you should be treated. There's really nothing to fear. I would much rather stand before God and be judged than I would some human beings that I've run into. Okay? Who judge on the flimsiest evidence that they even twist in their mind to put you in a certain category and, banish you from their lives or whatever. Oh, I've run into a lot of those. Okay. Because they judge on their own criterion and they don't know half of what they're talking about. Would you want somebody like that to judge you? I mean, no. No, you would want somebody who knows every single thing about you to say, have at it. Now, of course, when you get up there, you've tried your best. You have done what you think is the best. And if you can satisfy yourself that that's what you've done, then there's no fear standing in front of God to be judged. No fear at all. Okay? So, all right. Robertson says, have you heard of Caiaphas being a variant of Cephas? Some church fathers saw the comparison and contrast, including Protestant scholars. What these Protestants don't realize is the juxtaposition doesn't make sense unless they treat St. Peter as a new high priest. In fact, that was the supposition of their exegesis, without perhaps realizing its consequence. What is your thought? My thought is there's always people out there looking for some kind of connection in names. And it bothers me. It just shows me that they don't have a clue how to exegete scripture. when I see someone go after these names and try to make them match up, and a lot of Catholics do this too, and it just drives me crazy, because these are all speculative, allegorical kind of things that really don't add anything to our knowledge at all, except they can go ooh and ah over, wow, this word matches that word and all this stuff. It's all junk, okay? And I could show you all kinds of arguments that Caiaphas has nothing to do with Cephas, And then I may be able to show you some, similarities. Who cares? It just really doesn't matter. All right? Caiaphas has his own context and his own problems to deal with in the latter part of the Gospels, and Cephas has his own context. And the two are never mixed together. Okay? So there's just no comparison here. So don't be like these people who are trying to look under every corner and every crack for some symbolic meaning. Wow, this connects to this and all that. That's what kids do. Okay? That's what kids are interested in. You can always tell somebody who doesn't know Scripture when they go after things like this. Okay? So just leave it. Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. All right, question. What advice would you give to someone seeking a Catholic church to permanently attend? What to look out for? I mean, is there really an answer that nobody knows to that question? Brainstorm. I mean, we all know what to look out for, don't we? I mean, if you don't know it by now, well, let me try to list a couple things for you. First thing I would look for is this a quiet Catholic church? When you go in there and it's like 10 minutes before Mass, is it quiet? Are people respectful of the church? Respectful of one another, that, look, this is a time of prayer. And let's all be quiet and dedicate ourselves to the consciousness of the Lord in our lives. Can they do that? That's the first thing I would look for. Subtle, but still very important, because it shows you the whole tenor of the church. Okay. Second, I would listen to what the priest says during his homily. This is going to tell you a lot about who he is, what he likes and dislikes, how he views the church, the people in the church, how he views his responsibilities, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Does he preach on the Old and New Testament readings? Or does he have some agenda that he wants to promote? And I would definitely check to see if he speaks with a lisp. You may think that's funny, but no, I've seen that. Okay. There was a church right around here, St. Anne's, that we went to one time, and they had this seminary guy come over, and they had him give the homily, and he actually spoke with a lisp. And the whole congregation, they were just like, they couldn't believe it. So that kind of tells you what's going on around here. Okay, now you don't get that all the time, but look out for that. Okay. Look out for his social agenda. Find out, what he thinks about birth control, abortion, homosexuality, all kinds of things like that. And the moment you find that he is giving hints that he's of the liberal mindset and is all for these aberrations in our society, Don't spend another minute there. Find somebody else. And I would also go to confession and see how he handles confession. That'll tell you a lot about him. Okay. If you get one of these hand waivers, like, oh, don't worry, that's not a sin. It's not a sin, Or, I don't want to see you here that often. Come back every 5 years or so. All that kind of stuff. Not the place you want to be. I would definitely walk up to him, try to shake his hand. Look him in the eye, let him know that you're serious, and see how he shakes your hand. And if he's Father Limperist, you don't want him. Keep on going. Okay. But it gives you a nice manly handshake and a nice return look in the eye. You give him some time. Okay. You got the makings of a good relationship. Okay. So all these little subtle things you want to feel out as you're going through. And but you definitely have to be careful today. That is for sure. I would also see how many altar girls he has on during the Mass. If you have more altar girls, sometimes I've seen churches where they got 5 altar girls up there and no boys. Well, that tells you what kind of pastor you have. Okay. Or you see, a dozen female Eucharistic ministers walking around and no males, and the priest is sitting down. That tells you what kind of pastor you have. Okay. So, I could go on, but I think that's enough. So take that to her and see if that helps. All right, question. What's your take on the catechism saying we worship the same God as the Jews? I can't reconcile this with history. It would seem Jews returned to worship of Moloch right after Babylon. Yeah, but the catechism's talking about prior to the worship of Moloch, okay? Not during. There's a lot of Catholics today who worship Moloch. Yeah, all the Catholics that believe in abortion, yeah, they're Moloch worshipers. Okay, so the catechism, again, you have to look at this in context. The catechism is not giving us a treatise on the Trinity, okay, at this point in time. The catechism also says, that she has regard for the Muslims, that we worship the same God. Yeah, it all depends on what category you're talking about. If you're talking about monotheism, yes. If you're talking about the Trinity, the answer is no. Okay. Now, I think the catechism could have been much more forthright on this issue by not making it appear as if the Muslim can have his own concept of God and has no requirement to consider the Christian God. That should have been made clear. And maybe it is in other parts of the catechism, but you don't want to leave people hanging. You want to, if you're going to say an explosive statement like that, and the catechism, unfortunately, makes a lot of explosive statements like that. And these, of course, come from the liberal theologians who are, giving their 2 cents to who's ever writing the catechism. And that's one thing I would like to know. I would like to know who actually sat down and wrote this catechism. I want to know his name. And if he had help, I want to know each of their names. See, because the problem is that you get these kind of weird statements in the catechism, And you're like, well, who thought of that? And you look in the contents and nobody's name's there. It just says this is approved by John Paul II. Well, I can tell you this. John Paul II did not sit down and write some of those weird statements like you're pointing out about the Muslims and the Jews. Okay? And I am sure, I can almost be positive that he may have read a couple of statements in the catechism, but he didn't read the whole thing to go check it out and made sure that, you know, and who can trust John Paul II by himself, considering all the things he did in his pontificate to facilitate this kind of language in these catechisms. You know, he's the one who brought all these pagan religions to Assisi to pray to their false gods. Okay, so why would I trust John Paul II to go in there and vet the catechism to make sure it has no, extreme statements in it? And if he didn't do it, then who did? That's what I would like to know. Okay, because there are a number of these kinds of statements that people like me are going to have to say, well, you have to look at it in context, which is true. Okay, but it still leaves you with that icky feeling. Why did the catechism say this like this? And it's like, come on, can't you do better than that? Do you know how explosive those kinds of statements are? And apparently some of these guys do. And that's why I would like to know who they are. So we can say, now we know why the catechism says this. Because look, there's one thing we do know. The catechism is not infallible. Okay? It's authoritative, early, but it's not infallible. You know, so there's a lot of politics involved here, and I dealt with this issue when I was trying to get an imprimatur for my commentary. I mentioned this once or twice on this program, but I make a big deal in my commentary that the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, has been revoked. It's crystal clear in the scripture. It's crystal clear in magisterial church teaching. It's crystal clear in the fathers and the medievals. If there's one doctrine that I find that's crystal clear, it's that one, that the old Mosaic Covenant has been revoked. And yet there's a statement in paragraph 121 of the Catechism, the Catholic Catechism, that says the old covenant has never been revoked. And it's like, it's those paragraphs, 120, 121, 122, are all dealing with the Old Testament and how the Old Testament's inspired and it has all the books of the Bible in it and blah, 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 and how helpful they are for us. And then out of nowhere, it says, for the old covenant has never been revoked. And it's like, where did that come from? What is that talking about? And what do you mean by old covenant? Okay. Are you saying that that's the Mosaic covenant? Are you saying the Mosaic covenant has never been revoked? Can you clarify that for us? What old covenant are you referring to? Because so there was the Abrahamic covenant, there was the Mosaic covenant, there was the Davidic covenant. Which one? And they never tell you. Okay. But a lot of people have looked at this paragraph and they say, well, the Mosaic covenant has never been revoked. I read it right in the Catechism. No, you read that the old covenant wasn't revoked, but you didn't read the Mosaic covenant wasn't revoked. But see, this is where the confusion game starts. And who can we thank for that? Well, John Paul II. Yeah, because in 1981, he made a speech in Mainz, Germany, and said, the old covenant, never revoked by God. And everybody, the old covenant? Wow, you mean the Jews still have their old covenant? wow, that's a revelation. And so started the whole trek of different Catholic groups, cardinals and bishops, saying that the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, has never been revoked. The Jews still have it. And that's why they don't need Christianity, because God's going to save them through the Mosaic covenant. Yeah. The censor at my diocese here believes that. And so he couldn't give me an imprimatur for my New Testament commentary because I don't believe that. And neither has the church believed that the Jews still have the Mosaic covenant and can be saved by it. Okay, so, but the whole problem started with this. And let's say this, the only defense he had for his position was paragraph 121 of the Catechism, where it says the old covenant has never been revoked. And so, like, at least 24 times in his critique of my covenant, I'll say the old covenant, and he'll reference paragraph 121, and then I'll reference it again, and that's it. That's all he had. Okay, so you can see how these things can mislead people. Okay. Oh boy, I got a lot of gnats today for some reason. So yeah, you got to be careful. Be real careful. All right. Let me go on here. How do you see God sending an angel to lie through the pagan prophets in 1 Kings 22 in harmony with the doctrine that God is truth and does not lie? 1 Kings 22. Well, part 2. It seems God sending a distressing spirit to Saul, and his choosing their delusions, Isaiah 66, also show God can alter our mind and cause man to believe in falsehood. Okay, so I don't know where the lie is coming from. What lie are you talking about that the angel said? Okay, now, yeah, God can send a deluding spirit, and he does this when we decide to turn away from him. Okay, and there's dozens of passages in the Bible that either imply that or say it directly. You see, because the reason we can do something good is not from ourselves. The reason we can do something good is by the actual grace that God gives us. Even people that aren't Christian. If you see a pagan person do something good, it's not because that pagan person can actually do something good on his own. It is by the grace of God that he will do that. Because God gives actual grace to everyone. Okay? Whether they will follow through with all that and actually, submit themselves to God and become Christians and receive sanctifying grace, that's another issue. Okay? But when God withdraws his grace, he can leave you neutral, or if you have deliberately tried to hurt him, the church, families, whatever surrounds you, okay, and go deliberately against him, even if you're outside the church or inside the church, God can give you a demonic spirit, like he did with Saul. Okay. Why? Well, because Saul was an evil man. He had no intentions of following God. At every juncture where he was tested by God, he proved unfaithful. Everyone. And he's totally opposite. David was totally opposite than Saul. Almost every intention David had was good, even if he didn't accomplish it. At least his intentions were good. With Saul, everything was just the opposite. He had bad intentions all the way around. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes he wasn't. Okay, so you're talking about an evil man here. And when you're the king of Israel and you've been given authority by God to rule over them, you better make sure you do a good job, or else God is going to give you a demonic spirit, just like he did with Saul on several occasions. Okay. So, again, like I said before, this is no milquetoast God we're dealing with. Okay. He is as serious about his relationship with us as any being possibly could be. And he demands perfection. He understands our weaknesses, but only to a point. And if you are going to go against him, brother, you don't know what you're in for. Okay. And Saul is a great example of that. Okay. And that's why they're in Scripture, so that we know we're not dealing with just some pansy in the sky. We're dealing with a real personality who hates evil and hates people who do evil. Okay. And he will deal with it accordingly. All right. Please do not cease debating atheists. All right. Next atheist who asks me, I'll debate him. All right. Question. Is wormwood from the apocalypse an asteroid, an angel, or is it a symbol for something else? It's not an asteroid. Wormwood is basically it was used in Jeremiah, I think 7 or 11, around there. When the Israelites decided to disobey God, the prophets would make the people drink what they called their wormwood. And it was a, very pungent substance that had some deleterious effects on your body, and was a punishment for your sin, basically. And God says, I will make them drink wormwood. Okay. So wormwood there is taken from that Old Testament passage in, was it Apocalypse 9? Is it 8 or 9? Or 16? And it's talking about God's judgment, basically, is what it is. It's a symbol for God's judgment. God's coming to judge their sins, and whatever happens, happens. Okay. So he basically just getting that figure from the Old Testament for God's judgment. It's not an asteroid. And it falls into the sea, and then the sea becomes full of wormwood. And this is basically just saying that God is judging the whole area, the whole race, the whole human race. And the judgments that follow are delineated in the same chapter. But he's just making a connection from the Old Testament that John sometimes does, not all the time, and uses that for judgment of the people. Okay, so that will answer that. Was Adam and Eve created full of grace, as was Mary? Also, was Mary subject to concupiscence? All right, so Adam and Eve. No, not as Mary, because you have two different situations here. Okay. Mary was full of grace in the sense that she did not inherit original sin. Okay. And also would not fall into actual sin for her life. So that's what full of grace means on her action. With Adam and Eve, There was no original sin to inhibit because they were the first people on earth, of course. Okay. What we would say in the Catholic sense is so they didn't have sanctifying grace because there was no need for sanctifying grace. And that's what Mary's grace was. The initial grace was sanctifying grace to sanctify her from being subject to original sin. And then she had actual grace for the rest of her life so she wouldn't fall into sin. Adam and Eve had no sanctifying grace, but they would have actual grace. Okay, in other words, they were given everything they needed, including their intellect, including their conscience, but the grace of God to act uprightly in the face of temptation. Okay, and that's, of course, why they were judged, because if they didn't have the ability to obey God, well, then God could never judge them. Okay, so you can be sure that God gave them, everything they needed to make the right decision. And God wanted them to make the right decision. Okay. It's not like there's some force out there, where it's all been predestined and, and you can't get away from it. So Adam's bound to sin because whatever's up here is making him do that. And God somehow is taking part in all this and shaking his head when Adam sins. Yeah, well, I expected that, kind of a thing. No. Okay. God gave Adam every grace possible that God could give him and still be fair and just. Because there has to be a test. Okay. I mean, God could have given so much grace to Adam that there wouldn't really be a test for Adam because he could conquer anything and without any effort whatsoever. Okay, so there's a dimension to this that we need to take into account, that God's going to make it so that you have the power to not fall into the temptation, but not so much power that it remains a temptation. Okay, however God figured that out, who knows? But we know it's going to be just and fair. That Adam had everything he needed to do the right thing, and that God was on his side. Okay, there we go. All right. Was Mary subject to concupiscence? No, because see, that's what comes from original sin. Okay, that's we get the original sin taken away from us at baptism, but the consequence of Adam's sin is that we still end up with concupiscence as the punishment that we're going to endure for the rest of our lives because of Adam's sin. Okay. And so what happens is, we are, as humans, we are spirit and body. Okay. We're not spirit, soul, and body. We're spirit and body. Sometimes your soul is called your spirit. Sometimes your soul is called your body. Okay, it's a funny little word that the Greeks use there that can apply to either one. But your spirit and body in baptism, well, let's go back to Adam. In Adam's case, when he sinned, his spirit died. Okay, he still had a spirit, but it died in the sense that it was not filled with God's grace any longer. It was on its own. It was dead in that sense of the word. Okay. And his body died. Now, you might say, well, his body was still alive after he sinned. Yes, but the seeds of death were sown in his body. And at the moment he sinned, his body started to die. And it would take 950 years? Because he was a very, he was the first human and he was built very well. And God's going to let things take place naturally. And as they do, it's going to take a while to kill this body. 950 years. And that changed after the flood, of course, where, by the time of Abraham, we're down to 125 years. And by the time of Joseph, we're down to 90 years. Okay. So at any rate, you can see the seeds of death are progressing with each generation. When we receive baptism, the spiritual side of us is regenerated, the soul. Your soul is filled with the grace of God. Your soul, the quality of your soul changes, okay, back to what it was in Adam's time. All right. So our soul has been regenerated. The New Testament even talks about that as a resurrection, the resurrection of our soul, because it was dead prior to baptism and now it's alive after baptism because it's been regenerated. But our body has not been regenerated. Baptism does nothing for our body. Okay, it only works spiritually. And so does confession. So does the Eucharist. So does confirmation. They do nothing for our bodies. They only work spiritually with our soul. Okay, so the body's still dead, and it won't receive its resurrection until the last day, as Jesus told Mary. On the last day he will be raised, that his body will be renewed, regenerated. Okay, but until then, you still have a dead body with the seeds of death sown in it, and because of that death, your body seeks to sin. That's what Paul says in Romans 5, verses 12 to 14, and Romans 7. Your body's constantly seeking to sin because it's dead. Okay, the death that you received from Adam. And it won't stop seeking sin until that body is regenerated and made into a new spiritual body that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, or John 6 or John 5, when he talks about the resurrection of the body. Okay, so at the end of time, we receive our resurrected bodies, our new spiritual bodies, and they will be joined with our already resurrected souls that we received at baptism. And now we will be one complete human personality with both soul and body regenerated. And we will live that way for all eternity. And the body is going to be changed into something so fantastic that we can't imagine it. You're still going to recognize yourself as who you were, but you're going to be prim and proper, and you're going to have an incorruptible body, able to do many, many things, and be filled with joy and happiness for all eternity in this new body that is now not going to fight against your soul. See, that's what's happening now. Our dead body is fighting against our soul, and that's what we call concupiscence. Why is it fighting? Because it's dead. It's got the seeds of death in it. Okay, and we can see that happening to us every day, right? We get older and older, and we know we're going to die someday. So we can see it right plain as it is, the face on your face. You can see it. So anyway, that's how it all works. That's all how it all ties together. But Mary did not have that. Okay. Now, her body would die because of she received the seeds of death in her body. Okay. But because she had received a new soul, that means she didn't receive the concupiscence. Okay. Our concupiscence comes from the fact that we have this dead body that's constantly seeking sin. Okay. Mary did not have that because of her immaculate conception. Okay. So she was spared that. But still, we have to recognize that she died. Why? Because she was a child of Adam, just like we are. And that's why Jesus died, because he was a child of Adam and he had the seeds of death in him. If it wasn't the crucifixion that killed Jesus, he would have died of old age someday. Okay? So nobody escaped that death. But Jesus and Mary escaped a spiritual death. And that's probably, the most important one, dealing with our life on earth. Okay. Next question. We got 14 minutes left. How do you think the Cultural Revolution happened in the 60s due to the progressive era bringing in the Roaring Twenties? Because the 40s and 50s were really Christian. I'm not sure I understand. Let me try that again here. How do you think the Cultural Revolution happened in the 60s due to the progressive era bringing in the Roaring Twenties? Okay, so what the Roaring Twenties showed us was that if you let the concupiscence of man manifest itself without any limits, they will take advantage of it. Okay, so you had sexual things going on, you had drinking, you had cigarettes, you even had marijuana available at that early time. They saw that there was a whole contingent of society that no matter what you said to them, no matter what you did, they wanted their vices. Okay? And they tried prohibition for a while to stop the liquor flow, and that didn't work. And in 1933, they had to put it back into that, alcohol could be freely bought and sold anywhere. And you had money excesses, which led to the fall of the stock market in 1929. And you had sort of the same thing going on in the Roaring 1890s, the gay 90s, they called it. Okay. So, you see this sort of explosion of vices happen every so often in society. But here in the 1900s, you had a slightly different situation because you had the Depression following after the stock market crash, and that really set Americans back a step or two. And then you had World War II, and that was like the double whammy. First you have the Depression, then you have this big giant war that nobody else has ever experienced before, where all the countries of the world are fighting each other. And for 6 long years. And that just broke the hearts of a lot of people. And it was very devastating for the whole world. And then they came out of it, and it was like, okay, it's finally over. That's not going to happen again. And by this time, you had a lot of liberal thinking from the 20s and 30s that started to manifest itself. And one of them was birth control. Margaret Sanger was already in the 1920s preaching her gospel of, women's suffrage. And by that, she didn't mean that she just wanted women to vote. She wanted women to take over society. And she was all for, abortion and by any means whatsoever, because, as an independent woman, she was going to be independent from God, basically, and make up her own rules. And that kind of message was preached. And then there was birth control that came in the 1930s. And so those things were like simmering. And then World War II kind of put the lid on those. And then after World War II was over, those things sprung into action, birth control. And then you had Kinsey come along in the 1950s, and he started the sexual revolution. He was a homosexual, by the way, and made it look like sex was the best thing that mankind ever had, and everybody should engage in it, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, then you had Kennedy being killed in the early 60s, and Camelot was destroyed, and all kind of corruption took over after that. And then You had Vatican II and the lifting of a lot of restrictions in the church, along with the drug culture and the rock and roll culture of the 60s. And, that all took its toll on the human race, and especially in America. And a lot of this was a CIA plot. They wanted docile teenage boys to go fight the war for them, and there was a lot of voices against going to war, and so the CIA introduced drugs and made them docile, and the whole Alter K program and all that. It was just one thing after the other that was going on at these times, and the new generation did not want to go into the same mentality that caused World War II. They were tired of war. They were tired of people fighting one another, and they wanted a revolution against that kind of mentality. And they partly won that war. Okay. You guys were burning draft cards, and we had the Kent State, the gunning down of Kent State students because they were against the war. So the government made themselves look bad, and Nixon finally came along and gave a what he called the honorable end to the war in Vietnam. I don't know how honorable it was, because we pulled out of Vietnam with our tail between our legs. The American soldiers and the South Vietnamese couldn't get on those helicopters fast enough. And as soon as they did, the vacuum was filled by the North Vietnamese that took over. So all those years, all those bodies that were killed, 55,000 of them, was all for naught. And the kids said, look, you're not going to do that to us again. We go over and fight in a country 10,000 miles away because of your domino theory. And who's the one that decides to pull out and let the dominoes fall? The U.S. government. Okay. So, that just caused a lot of backlash against the government, and they weren't going to go there anymore. They were tired of being pushed around for the sake of, freedom. And yet they found that their own freedoms were being taken away in the United States themselves, under the guise of trying to preserve freedom. So, a lot of contradictory thoughts going back and forth. It's just a terrible time. I would not want to live through that again. And sometimes I wonder how I made it. But yeah. But this is how Satan disrupts societies, and the Pope had a lot of power to stop it, but he sat on his thumbs. Both Pius XI and Pius XII, they were told by heaven that if you do the consecration of Russia and you get the people to pray the 5 first Saturdays, we'll stop World War II. We won't let it happen. And they were told that by heaven itself. All you have to do is make this consecration. And they both said no, basically. And so God let the World War II come, and all the terrible things that came from it, because the popes didn't do their job. So, like earlier tonight, I was talking about depending on the Vatican to do the right thing, and tell us, what's infallible, what's not. They can't even get their basic things right. Like these popes supposed to be consecrating Russia so that we could avoid World War II. They can't even do that right. Some simple command from heaven. Okay. So, boy, talk about infallible. We know we're dealing with fallible men. Very fallible men. And anyway, let me go on before I get... We got 5 minutes left here. What is the Catholic view on the Pope during end times? It seems like he would be the beast that causes the world to worship the Antichrist, if not the Antichrist himself? Well, I don't think the Pope's going to be the Antichrist, but he and all his entourage, all his gay cardinals and bishops and liberal thinkers that they are, they're going to be setting the stage for the Antichrist. That's for sure. So I would say that the Antichrist will be better than the Pope, so to speak, in the worldly sense of the term. You know, the Pope's got his religious authority, but the Antichrist is going to be a combination of worldly authority and religious authority all wrapped up into one. And he's going to have powers of miracles. He's going to have the power of teaching wise things. He's going to have the power of controlling all the religious factions and bringing them into one. He's going to have the power of the secular, where he can control all the countries of the world. This guy is going to be a phenomenal character. I don't see any Pope filling that order. I can tell you that. Yeah, that's why Paul stresses it so much. This is going to be a character you're going to wish you never met, because he's going to be so influential, so powerful, that you're not going to be able to resist him. And I feel sorry for the people of the world who have not given their lives over to God before he comes. Because when he comes, it's going to be unlike anything you have ever imagined. That's the way Paul describes it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He's going to make himself look like you've heard of, you've heard of Caesar, you've heard of Genghis Khan, you've heard of Muhammad, you've heard of David in the Old Testament, whoever. He is going to set them all aside and say, I am better than all of them combined, basically. He is going to be someone who says that he is on a mission from God, that he is just like Jesus Christ, sent from God from heaven to help mankind out of his woes. And you can see that there are many. And give everybody a life of milk and honey and solve all our problems and be able to control everything as if he were God on earth. Okay? That's how powerful this man's going to be. And he will deceive the whole world. He will deceive the whole world. And then the end will come. God will come at some point and expose him for the false God he is, and the world will end. Okay? So, yeah, like I said, I don't see any Pope fulfilling that. And but they're all stooges to set the stage for the coming of the Antichrist. You can depend upon that. Okay, it is 10 o'clock. Time for me to go. I'm so glad I was with you tonight, helping you answer your questions. And I hope I have been another reason why you love the Lord and why you want to continue on in your Christian life. And if I haven't gotten to your question tonight, I'm sorry. I will try harder next time. But don't let that scare you off. Come back and we'll see what we can do for you. So we'll see you next week, which would be July. And what is that? July the 6th? Yeah, because July the 4th is Monday. So have a happy holiday. Enjoy the rest that the Lord gives you, and come back next week. We'll be glad to see you and talk with you. And while you're at it, stop over at robertsongenis.org. And if you could give us a little donation, we'd appreciate it. And we have some books for sale, of course. And that's all I can ask. So we'll see you next time. God love you all. And